Welcome, gentle listener, I am Baldermort, your faithful servant. Alas, it is the time of year when I take a brief break to hibernate and work on personal projects that I simply cannot manage while putting out content on the channel. My own book, etc. Still wrestling with that one. Hence, here is a collection of some of the stories sent out this year to tide you over. I expect this to be a big year for both myself and the channel, so do please forgive me this period of respite before the oncoming storm. And so, let us be about it. From the Bald Library. That's cute. Two Herculean titans strode across the plain towards the black obelisks, newly risen from the desert sands. Each footfall of the mechanical colossi took them hundreds of paces of a normal man, displaced tons of the sands beneath their metallic tread. The sheer width of their feet gave them a stability that belied the shifting dunes that usually made traversing the desert so hazardous and ponderous. As their robotic lurching gait ate the distance, they powered up their void shields. Bubbles of multispectral gravitic energies erupted out from both titans, covering them in a swirling pattern of light and dark twisting hues. Nothing short of an orbital bombardment could pierce these shields. Nothing. Cryptic Zamazduz, the elusive annihilator of the Rashnak, enslaver of the Knib, looked on from his command barge. If he still had organic eyes, the lids would be half-mooned in a look of languid sardonic demi-interest. Nothing shocked him these days, not since the slumber. But then, nothing truly engaged him anymore either. He slowly circled his necrodermis left foot attached to the leg crossed over his right knee. His metallic digits drummed on the arm of his throne. Nemesor Kapatush had entrusted this region of the awakening to him. He was torn between permitting the ungainly hulks to get within range of their primitive weapons, or just exterminating them forthwith. His curiosity got the better of him. The Titans raised their weapons. Zamazduz glanced at the chevrons on his screen and absorbed the information. A full record of their power spikes, their levels, origin, and concentration. Both Titans shot out enormous balls of plasma that sailed towards his outer picket monoliths. If Zamazduz still had lungs or need of breath, he would have given a deep sigh. The energy transfer was pitiful, its Genesis reactors little more than toys in the hands of children. The plasma balls slammed into one monolith, half melting the outer armor, but not penetrating fully. The volley from the second Titan sailed wide, as its target monolith floated into the air and hovered to its right. Zamazduz could have summoned a squadron of doomsday arcs. He could have activated a phalanx of doomstalkers he had secreted away in the dunes for just this sort of interruption. He could have unleashed a swarm of locust destroyers to slowly wear down the lumbering metallic bipeds. He could have brought up his seraptic heavy constructs and gained a few seconds of entertainment, watching them tear both interlopers apart with their synaptic obliterators. But that would be too easy. Zamazduz ordered his two mindless pilots to take his barge into the skies, just in case, as he erected a weave shield that would confound the sensors of the assailants. He now unfolded his legs and sat forward, concentrating on his displays. It was not much of a challenge, but he did so enjoy a deed well done. With a flicked control, he sent orders to the outer monolith, and 5 lifted into the air and sped towards the oncoming Titans. One he ordered to slow, and it was struck by these balls of plasma, melting it so badly that it crashed into the sands. But it was made of necrodermis. It would repair itself in short order. The readings he concentrated on most were the strange patterned fields that they had erected. One monolith closed, and its particle whip unleashed on the Titans, yet that did nothing to the shielding. Zemazdas then nodded, so much like Eldar technology, but more brutish. The wefts and weaves of reality were not being coaxed into obedience. The rules of physics were being smashed through sheer energy output and ignorance. Zemazdas gave very specific instructions to each monolith, and then leant back, disappointed. Despite how slow the monoliths were compared to nearly anything else under his command, they easily evaded most of the shots from these Titans, only one more being melted. The others now struck with their Gorse fluxes and flares. He had given them the exact positions, down to the nanometer. When their fire converged on the precise spot, they caused a feedback loop in the void shields. Only one spot in the entire overlapping array, but he had discerned it immediately. Child's play. Small explosions erupted from the Titans as their generators blew under the strain, and the shields went down. Then the monoliths fired their antimatter particle beams directly into the centers of the Titans, exactly where their engines lay. None of the monoliths escaped the detonations, as the plasma engines of the Titans gave off the yield and devastation of a small nuclear bomb. Zemazdas made a note of the confrontation for future reference. If the younger race's weapons were all this primitive, he would miss the Eldar, and this new era may turn out to be deeply tedious. From beneath you, it devours. We stand. There are 3 of us in this place. My Caedus Innumerabilis, and Soluta Era, and Fortis Neniam. Mine is a warlord. The other 2 are reavers. Before us are lines of Astromilitarum, our own Scitarii arrayed at our feet. We cannot move from this location, so they must defend us as we defend them. It has been hours, but we know they are coming. Then the clouds appear on the horizon. There is not enough precipitation on this world to form such things. The skies darken with their winged horrors. Below that, a wave of flesh and teeth and claws from one end of the horizon to the other. Bodies innumerable, all driven by the one urge, the one mind, so they say. To eat, to kill, to defeat us. I instruct my Moderati to lock our carapace weapons on the skies. Fire belches from them, and the clouds begin to fall to the ground as massive plumes of fire erupt amongst them. I level my arms and fire the Volkite destructors. Heat rays scour the ranks before us on the ground. Thousands of bugs vaporize as I scythe the front ranks again and again. Solutra Era and Fortis Neniam fire their volcano cannons. We reap and reap. Our weapons harvest so much that they cannot close with us. Each volley from our holy armature causes the ground to turn to lava, forming thick rivers that the bugs dive into and burst into flames, but cannot pass. We can do this all day. Perhaps we will have to. The clouds from above are but small winged things, no larger than a ratling. There are some larger beasts, but our carapace weapons burn those away with missiles and fire. The smaller ones slam into our shields, and it is like driving a rhino through gnats. They burst and fizzle. They cannot harm us. But it is then that I feel something is wrong. The Scitarii are disconcerted. They shuffle. Then they begin to fall. Not through claw or bolt. It is as if they cannot stand properly. Then even I feel it through the mighty legs of my metal body. There is a tremor in the ground. Then eruptions. We continue to fire out at the swarm, But pandemonium breaks out beneath us. Worms with massive jaws burst from the ground, tearing into my Scitarii, gulping down entire squads. Then, from the holes created by these sizable worms, tunnels, a landslide of limbs and teeth appear. These things are pale and haunting, wiry, like minuscule nightmares given flesh. They are tearing our defenders to pieces. We cannot stop firing at the horde. I raise one leg and stamp down. I hope I kill more worms and horrors than my own men. I do so again with the other leg. Solutra Ira and Fortis Nenium do likewise. But it is too late. I can feel them. They are digging their claws into my armor and pulling themselves up my body. I am the warlord. I can feel it all. How? Such small things. How can they puncture my armor? How? There are so many of them now. My moderati look to me in panic, firing at everything they can, but cannot fire on ourselves. I vent steam and it scalds many. I vent plasma out of our energy, and it slays many. But there are more. They are never ending. They clamber up my body, now massing on hinges and regions where they are scratching at me and pulling me apart. They are punching through. By the Omnissiah, not like this. Please. After 5,000 years of service. No. They are inside Caedus Innumerabilis. They are inside me. Enough darker. Big Meg Slobber Slugger's mouth dropped open, and an avalanche of gobsquigs dropped out. He was in awe. He was in love. He was witnessing what he could only call the closest thing to enough darker he had ever witnessed in all his years. Now most had laughed at the merest concept of enough darker, and Slugger had always guffawed with them. But now it was right in front of him. Oh, he had heard of a Gargant, but never actually seen one. The biggest, most orky thing he had ever witnessed before was a Gorkanaut, which was, indeed, quite shooty. But this, never in his wildest dreams did he imagine he would witness such glory, such sheer shootiness, almost endless darker, the kind one dreams of, yearns for, but can never believe actually exists, until now. The only downside was that it was not coming from a proper orky source. Now Slugger had heard the ruckus from a few miles away, had jumped up the side of the valley to take a shufti at what was creating such magnificent booming noises, and he was not disappointed when he clapped eyes on it. A huge Humi walker, unleashing carnage across the entire valley basin. The thing itself must have been at least some times bigger than a Gorkanaut, and where a chopper or sticker could be, it had two huge long shooters. They were easily the size of a Darker jet, with many barrels that rotated and dished out enough darker. Well, that was it. It was enough darker. Where the shooters pointed, everything died. Not just orkies, but trucks, gun wagons, bone breakers, dragsters, death dreads and killer cans, which was especially funny to watch as the wee grots were sprayed to the winds. Wherever the big Humi walker pointed its arms, the ducker was like a tsunami of total destruction, and Slobber Slugger could do naught but watch enwrapped. Well, until he finally worked out that the walker was swiftly running out of targets, and this even slight deviation from his wide-eyed lollygagging broke his transfixed stupor. I mean, there was nothing so truly hilarious as watching massive Darker do Gork's work, but it did now occur to Slugger that he really ought to step up a bit. These were orkies that were getting blasted after all. Slugger, being a big mech, now bellowed down into the valley he had come from. He was right good at shouting, so he elicited a swift response from his lads and grots. They all came up and were equally ensorcelled, until he bashed a few over the noggin and bawled his orders. The grot, they would be his answer to the Humi walker. and if he played this right, by Mork, there might be some looting to be done afterwards. The wibbly shields around the walker flared every now and again when one of the remaining Orkies in the valley shot at it with something big, and Slugger was in luck, for a large group of mega cannons and tractor cannons were now doing their best to bring the walker down. Fat chance, thought Slugger, but the shields on the walker were indeed flashing more often and looking a bit more wobbly than wibbly now. With a determined grunt, Slugger raised his weapon and was matched by a full lot of his mechs, every last one of them. When the cannons fired again, when the shield was at its weakest, Slugger yelled to order, and every last mech shot with their weapon. Lines of blue energy slammed out of their position and struck all over the walker. Many stopped at the shields, and the blue lines converted into green mush stains that sizzled, as a few thousand grots were teleported straight into the void shields. Yet many lines passed straight through and struck the main body and legs of the walker. The runt herds were bashing and pushing, and the grots and the snots were sent through the shock attack guns and directly into the Humie walker. As he had not told his men to stop firing, as he had no intention of missing out on the fun an overcharge can create, it wasn't long before some of his Orkies' weapons exploded in their hands and left a pair of smoking boots where a mech once stood. Slugger had finally lost more than was amusing, and so lowered his hand and shouted for a stop. The guns on the Humie walker had also stopped firing a few seconds before. Its legs had shifted, and it seemed like it was going to retreat, but then it just stopped. Slugger wished he could see the thousands of snots rampaging through the Titan. Now that would be a laugh. Then the walker began to glow. Although Slugger would have loved to see it up close, he rolled down the valley side and away from the emergency self-destruct that transformed the Humie walker into a mushroom cloud that nearly touched the heavens. There would be nothing to loot today, but, thought Slugger, this was no time for moaning. The Humies might have more walkers. Garand's chest burned like he'd taken a lungful of kef. He snatched at air as his legs pounded on and on. He wiped away the stinging sweat that cascaded from his brow and into his eyes. At each junction he looked back, coughed for a second, before gulping more air and continuing on. Ever onwards, he ran for his life. At each of his stops, where he could finally hear behind him, he could make out the whooping and laughter of his pursuers. No matter how far or how hard he ran, they were always there. Barely a minute behind him, and each time he stopped for even a second, he knew that they were gaining on him. He need only get home. Garand lurched forward again, now colliding with the tight corridor walls as he went, each strike slowing him that tiny bit, each one making him more fearful, more desperate. He should not have ventured out alone, definitely not so far, but he had no choice. The underways had been picked bare, ranging further and further each day in search of something, anything, he could trade for food. He knew it was inevitable that he would get caught in a tight spot, but he would not leave his home for so long without protection. What point would there be in his risk if he came back to everything stolen, his family dead? Garand could now see the light of their torches at the end of the tunnels. They were so close. The blazing brigands, youths and gangers of low repute, cowardly and cruel, they had never been involved in any of the true turf wars. Like rats, they scurried in these sub-tunnels and preyed on anyone who they found. On a good day, with a full pack for his las pistol, Garand would have stood his ground and taught them a lesson. But he had stumbled onto a large pack of them, and he had panicked. Unloaded in an attempt to get them to flee, but when his trigger depressed and nothing came out, they knew the game was afoot. They bounded from their cover and came after him. So he ran, and ran. So close now. He put on a last burst of speed, pumping his arms and legs as fast as they would go. Stumbling forward, he could see the bulk hatch in view. Yet, his fatigue was his undoing. One leg caught on the other, and he fell face first into the muck, sliding a few feet, but not nearly enough. The light they carried came up, and the horrors gave off a triumphant cheer. They could see him now scrambling to rise, like jackals in the night. They hollered as they knew they had him. The gangers were but a score of paces from Geraint when they all slid to a halt as the hatch lock twisted and the door opened. Their laughter ended as they saw the two figures silhouetted there. One was tall and lithe, long-haired and holding a wrapped bundle. The thing next to her was the real event. With one word from the newcomer at the door, "Kill!" the gangers gave a screech and ran, as a huge shape came at them like lightning. Slugger shot bounced off the front armour of the beast as it dove over Geraint's head and towards the gangers. Pounding all fours, the metal-clad dog swept forward and tore into them, and the screeches and laughter turned to pleading and pain. The woman came to Geraint and put out her hand. He rose with her aid and looked back as Spot sunk back to them both, more dripping with blood. Geraint patted him on the head and lovingly scratched behind his one organic ear. He winked at his wife and stated, "Well, with their boots alone, we shall eat for a month. With their weapons, we shall eat for a year." They both then broke into nervous, then real and heartfelt laughter as they walked with their cyber mastiff back into their home. Standing at the observation slit of his command bunker, Colonel Kurz, service numeral LK714/9G of the 413th Siege Regiment, looked down at the chrono. Brushing a layer of ash and grime from its readout with a gloved right hand, he checked the time. The first wave remained on schedule. He heard the distant boom of artillery pieces ripple from the rear of the Death Corps lines. Raising a pair of battered magnoculars, Kurz peered down into the Krieg trench lines laid out before the command bunker. Masked and armoured grenadiers shifted impatiently in position, heads down, braced for a thunderous barrage to come. Great-coated soldiers placed ladders against the tip of the trench, whilst commissars and officers stood ready. Some carrying loudhailers, others grasping chainswords and pistols. He adjusted his gaze to the scarred earth that separated the Creed positions from those occupied by the traitors. It was a muddy expanse of ruined vehicles, scorched tree trunks, razor wire, and shell craters. Despite being only a few hundred yards across the mire, the heretic positions were obscured by chemical haze. "Steady! Preparatory barrage incoming!" bellowed a commissar in the eerie silence. "Stand ready!" Kurz heard the rumble of artillery batteries. Dust shook loose from the bunker's thick ferrocrete ceiling. The first volley of shells whistled overhead, arcing towards the traitors' positions. The sound of the thunderous impacts rattled bones and shook the earth loose from the wooden walls of the trenches. Pools of toxic effluent that filled deep craters rippled as the round struck home. A second barrage landed, this time further away, creeping over the enemy line. Explosions rippled across the battlefield as ammunition and promethium detonated. Kurz hoped the effect upon the defenders had been as impressive as it looked. The grenadiers remained silent, waiting for the barrage to end. Then, in a violent crescendo of smoke and shrapnel, the third and final volley struck. Hovering servo skulls emitted high-pitched screams from their voxcasters. Death Corps soldiers emerged over the lip of the trench, climbing wooden ladders and striding out into the miasma of lethal gas that permeated Septemvirta's ashen wastes. The troops marched forward in order, never sprinting or breaking formation, bayonets fixed, trudging with a grim defiance that Kurz was sure would have made even the Emperor proud. He measured their progress against the range markers of his magnoculars display, green numerals flashing brightly over the static-laced visuals. 20 yards they strode, then 30, plunging through a toxic haze of ash and filth thrown up by the preparatory barrage. Kurz glanced at his chrono once more and gave a satisfied nod. The first wave was on time. Sergeant Tyborg, serial number X511Z/46, clambered up the rickety wooden ladder and followed his squad out into the miasma of no man's land. The Krieg soldiers managed to advance a few dozen yards before the first traces of sporadic fire erupted from the enemy positions. Through the smoke he could see the muzzle flare of heavy stubbers and the pinprick flashes of lasgun bolts lancing forwards to strike the first rank of grenadiers. The blind fire was not precise, but accuracy was hardly required in such a killing field. Krieg soldiers fell, bodies riddled with impact wounds. On the remainder strode, heedless of their fallen. The haze was lifting, revealing the enemy's position. He could hear the heretics bellowing orders to one another, their voxcasters screeching blasphemous prayers. Fresh craters covered the approach, with large sections of razor-wire defences blasted into ruin by the impact of the creeping barrage. Death Corps engineers crouched in the dirt, cutting additional routes through the wire and clearing minefields. In several positions, the enemy's forward trenches had been blasted open, the body parts of their occupants strewn all around. Still, the remaining heretics kept up a prodigious rate of fire, inflicting terrible losses on the advancing Death Corps soldiers. Mortar shells began to rain down in the midst of the advancing column, spraying lethal shards of glowing shrapnel through the Krieg ranks. Thankfully, the groans of the wounded and dying were largely drowned out by the deafening report of heavy guns. Tanks rumbled forward beside the Death Corps infantry. Battle cannons roared and metal tracks tore through the mire, grinding over the bodies of the dead and wounded. Bone and armor cracked under the relentless steel tread. Rattling stubber and staccato autocannon fire from the heretic positions deflected from the sloped armored plating of Lehman Russ tanks with audible pings and screeches. Las cannons found their mark, shearing a track from the lead tank and piercing the hull of a second. Fire licked from the vehicle's hull as burning tankers hauled themselves from hatches, screaming as they fell to the ground and rolling desperately from side to side in vain attempts to extinguish the flames. The man to Tyborg's left took a lasgun round to the knee and toppled into the mire. A burst of heavy stubber fire felled another to his right. The Death Corps soldiers continued forwards without so much as casting a glance towards their stricken companions. Tyborg drew his bolt pistol from its holster and followed the squad of grenadiers forward, slipping into the quagmire base of a shell crater. The first enemy trench lay no more than a few feet beyond their position, close enough for him to hear the guttural cries of the heretics over the whip crack of lasgun fire. The Death Corps soldiers scrambled through the cloying mud, grasping for handholds as they hauled themselves up the far side of the crater. Mortar shells rained down, deep sonic whistles audible before the heavy rounds exploded in the muddy ground, shrapnel scattering Krieg soldiers. A dozen or more Imperial Guardsmen were clustered around Tyborg now, struggling forwards, hemmed in on all sides by enemy fire. Several attempted to leave the crater, rising above its lip only to be struck down by a hail of bullets, bodies falling backwards to impede the remaining soldiers. The advance had begun to stall. Frustration gnawed at Tyborg as he looked down at his muddy chrono. They were behind schedule, and throwing himself into automatic fire wouldn't achieve a victory. He turned to the Vox carrier. "Hail the armor! We need supporting fire!" Standing in the cramped turret of his Lehman Russ tank, Gunner Dovon, serial number DR193/LK2, activated the traverse mechanism, tracking enemy infantry with a coaxial stubber. Tracer fire raked the trench line, causing a group of traitor guardsmen clad in mud-brown flak armor to duck for cover. Return fire, autocannon judging by the sound, slammed into the hull of his tank, caroming from its thick armour. "Infantry pinned down ahead. Traverse to 30 degrees. Traitor stop at position," came the voice of the tanker's commander, Sergeant Stagmar, over the internal Vox system. Gunner Dovon wrestled with the traverse controls and panned the stabilized gun to the left. Pressing his eye to the sight, he saw a group of grenadiers crouching behind the lip of a deep crater. Several dead bodies lay in the base. He saw the muzzle flare of a heretic stubber, concealed behind sandbags in an elevated position, raining fire upon the pinned grenadiers. He heard the heavy clang as the carousel autoloader moved another weighty shell into the breach. Rune displays flashed green, indicating ready status. "Gun laid on target," he growled into the Vox bead. "Fire!" ordered Stagmar. Dovon closed his hand around the firing lever, whispering a rhythmic prayer for accuracy, and yanked backwards. The battle cannon roared, its recoil shaking the Lehman Rust on its tracks. The shell slammed into the sandbags and detonated, igniting ammunition and causing a crackling fireball explosion that consumed the heavy stubber and crew. "Good effect! Target neutralized," Stagmar said. "Driver, forward!" Through the gunner's sights, Dovon watched as the grenadiers clambered out of the crater and covered the last few yards towards a heretic trench, tossing frag grenades into the enemy positions as they ran. Some fell, lasgun fire from the defenders cutting them down before they could bring their bayonets to bear. Dovon depressed the trigger of the turret's coaxial stubber, spraying the enemy lines with bullets, and was rewarded with bright puffs of gore as the heavy rounds found their mark. The tank ground forward over the dead and dying. Dovon felt little sympathy for those crushed beneath the weight of the vehicle. Their fight was over anyway. "Enemy armor cresting ridge at 310. Traverse left." Stagmar's voice carried a trace of panic this time. Dovon wrestled with the turret traverse again, bringing the heavy cannon around as the driver adjusted the tank's facing. His sight settled over the jet-black bulk of a traitor tank, its armor emblazoned with red sigils and festooned with macabre trophies. Its turret was already leveled towards them. The autoloader whirred again. Dovon placed a trembling hand upon the firing lever and prayed to the god Emperor. Through his magnoculars, Colonel Kurz saw the traitor armor crest the ridge beyond the enemy trench and grimaced as their cannons flared. He watched the last remaining tanks of the 12th platoon erupt into flames or come grinding to a halt, their hulls blasted open, leaking fuel and smoke. He winced involuntarily. Without armor support, the first wave was doomed. "First wave casualties estimated at 75% and increasing," said his adjutant, voice slightly muffled by his rebreather hood. Kurz lowered his magnoculars and drummed a gloved finger against the bunker's ferrocrete wall as the slaughter unfolded before him. The grenadiers at least had reached their objective, traces of lasgun fire from the enemy trenches betraying the ongoing fight. How long they could hold their position, he had no idea. He glanced down at his chrono again and waved his Vox operator forward. "Contact the batteries. Prepare smoke barrage. Second wave assault to commence forthwith," he ordered. Gazing out at the field of broken bodies and smouldering wrecks, Colonel Kurz gritted his teeth. He still had 4 companies in reserve. If the foe thought the resolve of the Death Corps had been broken, they would soon be disavowed of this belief. Corporal Dran held his lasgun in trembling hands, casting a wide-eyed gaze across the bombed-out cityscape that lay before him. His 3 remaining squad mates moved into position at his side. They had taken cover in the hollowed-out ruin of a hab block. The ceiling and facade of the structure had been fractured by the invaders' precise orbital barrage, leaving only a low wall behind which to cover. Garrett, the rawest member of the squad, pawed at his helmet, unfastening the leather chin strap and breathing heavily. "Where's Sarge?" he asked, clearing sand from his lasgun. "Dead," answered Trooper Orvon. Enemy munitions continued to streak down, few in number, but unerringly accurate. In the aftermath of each impact, screams of pain and the crackle of burning munitions could be heard. Around the blasted bunker in which Dran's squad had taken cover, Cadian soldiers rushed to seek shelter from incoming fire. Dran could hear the cracks of lasgun fire and the high-pitched whine of the Xenos invaders' guns as they pressed their assault.
"Quiet!"
Dran barked, peering through the gathering sandstorm.
"What in Throne's name are they?"
Garrett whined, rising to train his gun down the road.
"Xenos,"
Dran replied sharply. Trooper Irons, a grizzled veteran whose ragged beard spoke to the length of his deployment, remained uncharacteristically silent, sitting with his back against a low wall to Dran's right and wiping down the cooling shroud of his melter gun with a rag.
"Any word from command?"
said Dran, turning to Orvan, who bore the squad's Vox unit upon his back. He shook his head.
"Then we follow orders. Hold position."
Garrett let out a frustrated sigh.
"Without armor support, we're finished." "You were dead the moment you put on the uniform, get it? Get used to it,"
Irons replied dryly. Dran ignored the back and forth between his squad mates, focusing his attention across the roadway. Through the dust clouds, he caught a flash of movement, something lithe and swift, scurrying through the husks of burnt-out buildings. He snapped his lasgun into position.
"Weapons ready! Enemy infantry incoming!" he shouted.
The troopers shifted into firing positions, las guns resting atop window frames and scrap metal, wide eyes scanning for movement. Dran could feel his hands trembling. He swallowed hard as he fought to steady the wavering muzzle of his weapon. He could see more shapes moving, darting between cover. He felt his weapon vibrate and heard the soft thrum of engines. A volley of fire ripped across the roadway from the Xenos' positions, sizing through the dust storms to slam into the stone walls and deflect from scrap metal obstructions. Dran ducked involuntarily as the shimmering projectiles whistled overhead. To the east and west, he could hear lasgun fire as the enemy assault reached the first line of defenses. The Xenos soldiers rushed forward in small bands, all clad in bluish, form-fitting armor with long power weapons and pistols grasped between slender digits. The majority wore conical helms, the lenses of which glowed red. The figures darted across the roadway, bounding strides carrying them swiftly towards Acadian positions. Drawing a bead on one of the aliens, Dran squeezed his lasgun's trigger. The Xenos reacted swiftly, darting aside. He fired again and again, his final shot hitting the target. The bolt burned through the Xenos' breastplate, and it fell. Dozens more followed, their lilting battle cries filling the air. An armored sentinel lumbered into position beside the bunker, its autocannon spooling up with a loud rattle and glowing red-hot as it spat armored-piercing ammunition into the Xenos. The first wave of blade-wielding enemies ducked behind cover and began snapping off shots with their pistols. Beyond them, Dran could see the ominous shadows of hovering tanks drifting into position. More armored warriors sprang swiftly out of the vessel, bringing with them floating weapons platforms.
"Armor! Irons! Get that melter forward!"
Dran barked. The hovering vehicles drifted closer, their turrets spitting laser fire and searing beams of blinding light into defensive positions. Dran reeled, shielding his eyes, as a blazing lance of light erupted from one of the hovering tanks and hit the sentinel in the center of its canopy, passing straight through the walker. The sentinel's ammunition erupted into flame and it toppled onto its side before exploding. Dran's squad threw themselves to the ground as a hail of shrapnel and fire washed over them. Irons made use of the conflagration and obscuring smoke cloud to move, scrambling over debris, corpses, and broken armor glass. Garrett and Dran rose to provide covering fire, snapping off lasgun bursts at any Xenos foolish enough to emerge from hiding. Orvan crouched low, hands over the headset of his Vox unit, bellowing status reports to company command. Heaving his melter gun, Irons dragged himself to cover behind a deactivated plasma conduit and raised the weapon. Resting its cooling shroud atop a conduit and centering it on the armored vehicle, ignoring the blizzard of fire spinning towards him, he fired. The air hissed as a beam of superheated energy erupted from the melter gun towards the graceful skimmer tank. The first shot missed, fizzing over the canopy of the target. The mess had given away Iron's position. Xenos warriors pointed in his direction and began turning their weapons upon him. Gerrit and Dran continued to fire upon the foes, forcing them to keep their heads down. Irons ignored the hail of incoming fire and loosed another melter beam. This one struck home. Energy shields flickered and died as the beam burned its way through and struck the vehicle's armor. The hovering transport tank plummeted, striking the ground with a loud crash. Gouts of flames flickered from a smouldering hole in its hull. But any sense of triumph was fleeting. One of the Xenos' weapon platforms had locked onto Irons' position. A blizzard of shimmering projectiles burst from its barrel and scythed towards the exposed trooper. Blood sprayed from a dozen wounds as the alien ammunition sliced neatly through flak armor and flesh before burying itself into the walls. Iron's body toppled backwards into the dust, his melter gun falling to the ground beside him. The Xenos immediately turned their attention towards the rest of the squad. The sword-wielding enemies danced forward, their seemingly insubstantial armor absorbing or deflecting the few lasgun rounds that found their mark. Dran let out a loud curse as one of the foes vaulted over the rubble covering the entrance to the bunker and landed before the three guardsmen. Gerrit froze as the warrior bounded forward. The assailant lunged, blade outstretched, and with a casual flick of his wrist, decapitated him. His lasgun fell from lifeless hands, and his corpse slumped to the ground. Dran backpedaled towards the bunker's broken doorway, firing from the hip as he sought to escape. Proximity prevented the Xenos warrior from dodging. Several lasgun rounds burned straight through its armor, and it fell. Dran fumbled numbly for another power pack, trying his best not to look at Gerrit's corpse. As soon as the dead alien's body hit the floor, more of its kind cleared the rubble and burst into the hab bunker. Shoving Dran out of the doorway, Orvan took a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and tossed it into the bunker. The opponents darted back to avoid the explosion. Dran and Orvan made use of the momentary distraction to exit the structure just as the explosive detonated. A shower of rubble and dust erupted from within. Orvan's Vox unit crackled. "Reinforcements inbound! All forces, fall back to the secondary defensive line!" a static-laden voice exclaimed. Orvan rose first, extending a hand to drag Dran to his feet. They backpedaled, firing to hold the Xenos back. Others were in full retreat now, dozens of Cadian soldiers fleeing their overrun positions. High above, alien aircraft roared through the clouds before screaming towards the battlefield and strafing the guardsmen with their laser weapons. Glowing shrapnel fell in all directions, the hail of shimmering projectiles intensifying as the swift Xenos gained on the retreating guardsmen. Dran felt a flash of agony in his left leg. Ignoring it, he continued sprinting hard. Streaking jet bikes swept into view, their white chassis glistening in the blazing sunlight. They swept down with quicksilver speed, riders leveling long lances. Dran threw himself to the ground as they passed, feeling the heat of their engine flare wash over him. One of the riders angled towards Orvan, who continued to sprint in a futile attempt to escape. The rider's lance struck him in the back, a flash of light emitting from its tip. He folded up mid-sprint, rolling across the dusty ground, Vox unit erupting in a shower of sparks. The riders wheeled away, leaving scores of dead soldiers in their wake. Dran scrambled forward. The next line of defense lay no more than a few feet ahead. He could see the standard of the Cadian 66th fluttering in the breeze. Behind a series of aegis defense barriers, a hardened core of survivors held firm. A regimental preacher stood in their midst, reliquary raised aloft, auto-pistol clasped in gnarled hands. The toothless zealot cried out to the fleeing Cadians, "Flee not in the face of death, for the Emperor blesses the martyr and shuns the craven." Dran scrambled into cover behind the barrier, heart pounding. He reached for the Aquila pendant, fastened around his neck, and clasped it tightly in his trembling hand. The priest's voice rang out again, loud and clear. "Hold, warriors of Cadia! Hold in the name of the Emperor!" Dran released his Aquila. He took a deep breath, swallowing the fear, purging the doubt from his mind. The priest's words hardening his resolve. He would hold the line. for the Emperor and for those that had fallen this day. He raised his gun, sighting the Xenos, and with a whispered prayer, opened fire.